It's a cold night out there. I want to especially thank all my students from my urban theory class who walked all the way from their normal class location at Micah for coming out to tonight's event. It's really exciting from my perspective as somebody who's been teaching this stuff to actually have a chance to have a discussion with folks who have been doing really amazing on-the-ground work for, in many cases, very, very long amounts of time. Really kind of challenging the way the city is built, developed, who it's built for, who gets to live in it, who gets to live where, and how those decisions are made. So it's a really, really important subject today in Baltimore. We've got a lot of stuff going on in the city that is pretty questionable, and we've got a lot of lack of imagination about what's possible in terms of racial and economic equity in the city. So it's really great to be here with the folks here who are going to be talking about all this. I do want to, first of all, welcome everybody to Red Anna's. Anybody here for the first time? Okay, just a couple. Well, we're a worker-owned business, so everybody you see working behind the counter over there or over here is a worker owner of the business for the most part. And we are really excited to be celebrating our 10th anniversary, which we just celebrated on Saturday. And we're really happy to have a space like this that we can use for free events that get into vital issues that are facing the city and beyond. I don't want to spend a whole huge amount of time talking about events that we've got coming up, but I do want to mention one because it's really, if you're interested in what's going on here and you're thinking about what's possible in terms of strategies to demand a better city, to fight for a better city, there's an amazing group that's active in Spain right now called the People Affected by Mortgages. And this is a group of folks who have come together in the wake of the housing crisis in Spain, which is as bad, if not worse, than what's been going on here. And they've come together to create militant resistance to evictions and militant resistance to speculation in property. So they've, they've blocked, according to what they've told us, 1,135 evictions with popular grassroots power. They've taken over 27 empty buildings and moved homeless families in. So it's a really, really vibrant grassroots horizontal social movement that's really putting into practice a really important critique of housing in the city and getting really concrete results. They're going to be here. We'll have a representative from the group, People Affected by Mortgages, here on Saturday, December 6th. And we'll also be screening a documentary that explains and documents their whole struggle that's going on right now. So really exciting. All right, so that brings us to tonight's panel. First of all, I have to apologize on behalf of the Right to Housing Alliance. We were supposed to have both one of their lead organizers as well as an organizer and public housing resident who is going to be speaking about the work they're doing in the context of the rental assistance demonstration program. That program that's basically privatizing a giant chunk of Baltimore City public housing. Those folks, for totally independent, crazy, simultaneous, medical emergency related reasons, are unable to make it tonight. But I think we'll have a really robust discussion anyway. I know there are some folks here who can speak a little bit to some of the stuff that's going on in public housing, even if we don't have it represented on the panel. All right, so it's we do have some great folks here though, and it's my pleasure to introduce them. We have all the way from San Francisco, JamesTracy. He's a remarkable, long-time radical community organizer, housing justice activist, co-founder of the San Francisco Community Land Trust. And somehow, despite all the amazing grassroots work that he does, he also manages to be a pretty amazing writer who keeps churning out amazing books. He's written a wonderful book called Hillbilly Nationalist, which is about the history of poor white working class organizations that made common cause with the Black Freedom Movement in the 1960s. And he's the author of this new recent book, Dispatches Against Displacement, Field Notes from San Francisco's Housing Wars. And this is a really important thing to be talking about because when we think about displacement, we think about gentrification, We think about lack of affordable housing. San Francisco really comes to mind pretty quickly these days. We've all seen the images of buses being blockaded, and we've seen even just on this cover here, they used a little screen capture of Craigslist showing just how much it costs to rent a one-bedroom apartment in neighborhoods that used to be for working class people of color in the city. So it's a really, really important kind of hyper test case for a lot of what's going on nationwide, and it's really exciting to have him here to talk about his work and to talk about his book. We also have with us folks from the Housing as a Human Right Roundtable. We have Rachel Cutler from the United Workers and Donald Gresham from BRACE, the Baltimore Redevelopment, no, I'm going to get it wrong, Action Coalition for Empowerment, there we go, which is a group that is carrying on the work of anti-displacement in East Baltimore, where Johns Hopkins, if you don't know, Johns Hopkins has basically remade that neighborhood in its own image and over and against the wishes of the long-term residents of that neighborhood, and they've been fighting a really amazing and inspiring kind of struggle to make sure that that process is carried out with whatever is possible in terms of gains for the residents who are staying. And the United Workers have created this Housing as a Human Right Roundtable to kind of bring together folks working on housing issues across the city and to think about alternatives, notably a community land trust framework, which I'm sure we'll hear a lot more about tonight. So that's what we've got in store tonight. I think it's going to be a really amazing discussion. We'll hear from the panelists. They'll talk for about 15 minutes each, and then we'll have some discussion between the panelists so they can compare notes on housing struggles in Baltimore and San Francisco, and then we'll open it up for some questions from the audience. So please join me in welcoming our panelists.
So I guess I'll take it that I'm up first. So thank you everybody for coming out tonight. My name is JamesTracy. I'm from the Bay Area where I was born in Oakland, spent about 2 decades in San Francisco, lived out in the blue-collar suburbs of Vallejo and El Cerrito as well, which, in the East Coast terms, have probably all been one city, right? But our geographies are very, very, very different in the San Francisco Bay Area. So how I got involved with fighting for the human right for housing is that I was a truck driver. I was a truck driver for a place called Community Thrift Store. And I used to go all around San Francisco picking up donations of people's belongings, of records, of books, of clothing, of furniture. And it occurred to me that what was happening is that we were picking up the belongings that were being donated by landlords, but they actually belonged to people who were being evicted in 1991 to 1992. Of course, San Francisco has laws against the dispossession of people's property in such ways, but as we know, most laws, when they come to landlords, when they come to speculators, they're meant to be broken by the same people. So, my friends and I started a group because we were very young at the time, and we thought that no good organizing was actually happening in San Francisco, right? We were the ones that had the correct political line. We were the ones that would know how to bring direct action back to the tenants movement. Nobody else was doing it. We were wrong about that, but the Eviction Defense Network is pretty great anyhow. We were the type of people that if your grandma was getting evicted, we'd find her landlord and we would dog him for weeks on end. We would go to his place of business, we would go to his home, we would go to his church, and we would unevict quite oftentimes. We were very, very successful. You've heard of nonprofits. We were the non-profit. We were funded rather by 2 benefits what we used to call Rocky Gets Rent a Month, because there's a bartender in the Mission District who we had actually helped fight his evictions, and he said, hey, Sunday nights I have no tipping people here. Why don't you use this place? And so that's how we were largely volunteer run, very grassroots, and a little bit full of ourselves, but because of our independence, we were invited actually and given the honor of organizing with residents of public housing at North Beach Public Housing. Has anybody been to San Francisco, know where North Beach Public or even North Beach is? So this particular housing development was exactly where the cable car turns around, right almost in the middle of the courtyard there. And needless to say, prime real estate, a very functional community, a very wonderful community. And that's where I really cut my teeth on how to organize under the leadership largely of black women, largely of veterans of the civil rights movement. We a woman who I like to bring into the room, her spirit, Alma Lark, was learned right under Ella Baker. We had former Black Panthers, we had Black Liberation Army folks. We had people that had just learned how to do decent face-to-face organizing because they had a summer job canvassing for the group formerly known as Acorn. So the question about insider, outsider was very, very easy because this was a group of highly organized, highly political people that they knew exactly what to do with their allies, right? There was no processing, no encounter sessions, no guilt trips. It was like, this is what we need from our friends, right? And what we need from our friends is the elevators busted, and so are our knees because of our years of struggle, and we need you to go up there and put out some flyers, right? So, and that's where I really learned about things. I didn't learn about things about privatization and neoliberalism from studying what was going on in other countries, although that's extremely important. I am an internationalist, and even I was then. But I learned it from watching the privatization of public housing and the impacts that it had on people that I really care about very much. That was during the Hope 6 process, right? What we used to call the Hope 6 process and the Hope Less process. I don't think anybody who lives in Baltimore needs to be schooled on that. But in a nutshell, it was tearing down public housing, rebuilding it under formulas and schemes that would dispossess 70 to 80% of the original tenants. The demands of these brave fighters were not exactly the most radical things, except in the context that they were made. They were, we want to come back. We want jobs for our kids. We want this as a gateway into true self-sufficiency, not that phony self-sufficiency that that housing authorities and HUD officials like to talk about, but true self-sufficiency, true economic self-reliance, true autonomy. They wanted their lives to be better. They wanted their neighborhoods to remain intact. They wanted their community networks to be strong and strengthened by the process. North Beach Public Housing was a fantastic example of what people could do with very, very little resources, right? Keep in mind that nobody had a foundation grant to do this type of work, but we came together and we a lot of us in the Eviction Defense Network wanted to do direct action. We were very quickly told by a lot of our comrades from North Beach Public Housing that they loved that idea, but they also had child protective services to deal with, right? If they got arrested, the consequences could be much worse. And they also had immigration and naturalization services, parole and probation stuff. So we came up with this wonderful strategy, literally by sitting up all night, just thinking about how we can harness the strengths of insiders and outsiders working together with one fist. We came up with the vote with your butt strategy. The vote with your vote strategy, we figured out that 30%, we found out that $30 million had to be returned from San Francisco over back to Washington, D.C., and they didn't show sufficient progress towards getting people out. So came up with a 10-point program around the right to return, and people came together and signed cards, put up signs saying, we won't move until this legally binding exit contract is signed. And still today, 70% of the original tenants in North Beach still live there. They signed an exit contract, which is now actually still has life because the city knew the consequences the consequences of the Hope 6 stuff. So the way that we're dealing with our RAD program that Baltimore is dealing with, the residents are actually starting off on a much higher level of rights, which of course, you can put anything in, especially in a liberal city, you can put anything something out on paper, right? You have the right to this, you have the right to that. And they're still gonna have to enforce it with the organizing, but the beauty of that, it was a gift. It was a gift from one generation of activists. It's still very, very strong today. And we recognize this as austerity. We recognize this as neoliberalism. And but most of all, we recognize the need for solidarity, not in obviously, solidarity is a moral and ethical thing that is good on its own merits, but we also saw that it's a material and strategic basis of solidarity between people who live in public housing and people who live outside of public housing. In the most gentrified neighborhood of San Francisco, the Mission District, when Valencia Gardens public housing was announced that it would be torn down and that the displacement and dispossession would happen, the evictions in the surrounding blocks of people who did live in public housing, they rented from landlords. The speculation went through the roof, right? So as the great prophet James Baldwin said, if they come for you in the morning, they'll be back for me at night. Well, these bozos at the housing authority didn't wait till night, right? In the afternoon they were out there. These landlords were out there dealing with eviction notices, and so we very quickly had the analysis that we knew that because of the persistence of white supremacy in the liberal city, because of the persistence of class hatred and the dialogues of the horrendous toxic dialogues around welfare reform at the time, that we weren't going to be able to get everybody together to fight, right? But we would find everybody who was willing to work with one another, whether they become their newer residents, older residents, whatnot. We wanted to bring people together, and that was breaking down the political isolation. Because whether you're talking about a domestic violence situation or whether you're talking about political violence, isolation is the prerequisite for abuse, and we recognize that very early on. So this book you should ruthlessly interrogate. They take nothing at face value, because I'm someone who's dedicated 2 decades to fighting for the human right in San Francisco, and as you well know, San Francisco is extremely expensive. We haven't won, we have failed, and I want to put that out. But these stories that I pulled from just my notebooks and pictures and stuff, I might not even be the best guy to write this story, but I'm the person who took really good notes and took pictures and kept those notes and kept those pictures and recorded the voices of people who might never write their own books and respected those things. I want to talk a little bit about the Mission Anti-Displacement Coalition, because I think that its promise and its downfall is actually really instructive for anybody in any city. We all know that San Francisco and Baltimore are very different cities. The things that are wrecking Baltimore are different in many ways than San Francisco. The Mission Anti-Displacement Coalition started off in 1999 and was absolutely groundbreaking. It was the first time that many of these disparate groups started working together and actually figuring out how to work things out. It was largely Latino-led. My dear friend Eric Casada, who's no longer with us, who was a very devout radical, anti-capitalist, socialist, was one of the key leaders there, and made sure that the tenure and the leadership reflected the long history of working class Latino presence in the mission. So it was very smart because it was able to talk about race plus class plus mass, and for a while, for the while reaching out to all working class people in the neighborhood, but also having a constructive dialogue with artists, right? And artists oftentimes are seen as the gentrifiers, like as the cause of the problem. Hipsters with their funny little mustaches and beards and proclivities for vegan donuts and shitty music. But you know what? The hipsters aren't the problem, right? I mean, they can be the symptom of the problem. Artists can be the symptom of the problem, but the problem is real estate agents and the speculators. And that, while claiming a space for really, really sharp race and class analysis, also reached out. Because one of the things that we knew is that, you know, we wanted to honor the space for longtime San Franciscans, but we all know the longtime San Franciscans, like longtime Baltimoreans, often come from somewhere else, right? You have working class black people and families that came during the black migration from the south north. You had our queer brothers and sisters that came to San Francisco for the very honorable thing of escaping really bad conditions where they were born. We had newcomers that were political refugees from El Salvador and Guatemala. And we also had kids that grew up in the suburbs, you know, like myself, a blue-collar suburb that was just really boring and really violent, and we wanted to chart new paths. So we wanted cities to be able to grow, welcome new people, and we wanted to focus on, on the real enemy that was making it impossible for cities to actually grow in a positive direction, because all of the changes that were being proposed required breaking the backs of working class people, particularly communities of color. Mac did such fantastic work. We put thousands of people out into the streets, did lots of direct actions. It was a really, really wonderful year and a half where Mac was really at its apex, and it actually survived in honorable ways till about 2007. But we were also the victims of our own success. Because we were very media savvy, we were able to change the tone in San Francisco in around displacement. And what that meant is that people voted, right? People voted differently and got rid of all of the really horrible people on the board of supervisors and replaced them with people that, at least at the outset, had fairly good politics. So those of us who were once used to having to in order to get an appointment with a member of the board of supervisors, you had to go chain yourself to their desk, right? And now all of a sudden, we had insider access, right? I was like, hey, Supervisor Daley, you know, I have a really good idea for a piece of legislation you want to carry it, right? We became at the time where we would have been able to chart a new course for urban politics, a new course where we could have insider and outsider power. We chose the insider power largely, with some exceptions, of course, right? We still managed to put down protests, but the tone was very different when you're friends with. That was a mistake. But our biggest mistake, which will lead us into some of the work that these guys are doing, was that we did not prioritize the decommodification of housing. We advocated for more affordable housing. San Francisco is a little bit different because we actually have, let's say, about 60% of our affordable housing providers are ethical and decent, right? And so I hear that it could be very different in other cities. But affordable housing is a good way of providing more units of housing for people, but it can't be used it's not a community stabilization. Community ownership, things like limited equity co-ops, community land trust, figuring out ways to take buildings out of the speculative market and put it into community control. That's what we needed to do. We did valiant fights against our planning regime, and that was great. It exposed kind of the hidden hands of neoliberalism and corporate collusion, but it wasn't a community it wasn't a community preservation strategy, and we should have known better. Right? And that was a gigantic mistake. But a lot of us went on to form the San Francisco Community Land Trust, which I talk a lot about in the book. We have only about 65 units of housing, 65 grants is a good example, I like to call them right now, but we're trying to build a movement towards that. My role is to continually center the idea that housing is an actual human right. It's not a privilege, right? It shouldn't be optional. That the right to a city is a very complicated idea. That is something that we need to fight for, refine, clarify. And the final point that I need to segue here is that you can't just win the human right of housing. If we all of a sudden won the human right of housing within the current neoliberal construct, it'd be a better day, right? It certainly would be better than what we have right now if we know that no matter what happens, we have something. But what happens if we have the human right to housing and everything else stays the same, right? What if labor stays precarious? One of the things that I know is that every time our comrades go to have a protest, go to City Hall, do all the things that organizers do, is that the people who fight us oftentimes are the trade unions, right? And I would like to think that the trade unions, most of them, aren't just conservative and backwards, but we live in a city where the human right for jobs and the human right for housing are pitted against each other, right? People need both jobs and housing. So the work of fighting for thriving wage, I don't even like to say living wage anymore, right? I like to name high thriving wage, dignified, socially useful, socially constructive housing, jobs. What it does is that it ends the hostage situation. When somebody says, I want to build this in your neighborhood, you don't have to say, okay, well, I really hate that. It might harm my neighborhood, but we need the jobs, right? If you already have an economic basis, if you already have jobs or income, then people are no longer hostages, right? And then you can talk about what does decommodification of housing really look like, because people have some breathing room. It's a statement against the politics of desperation, of urban desperation, saying that we just need to let everything go so people don't want to move here. Well, if you read Neil Smith's book, Gentrification in the Revenge of City, disinvestment is actually the first phase of gentrification, right? And it's about organizing, demanding all of the resources where we can really make a truly thriving cities for all of us who make this beautiful. I do actually, and I will add that I do actually believe that while we fight for everybody, right, while we fight for the 99% and all of its rungs and all of its levels of advantages, that we also need to think about reparations. Housing reparations. We all know that the history of dispossession, redlining, hope-sixing, urban renewal has disproportionately impacted not only, but mostly Black communities, and that has generational impacts about people's ability to even get ahead a little bit in this world. So if we're talking about building more for all, we also need to look at housing reparations. So I think I've gone on too long. I apologize if I have, because these people are one of really some of the finest organizers here on the East Coast, perhaps in the country, and I think we have a lot to learn from them. I want to thank this fine space for creating something where so many people can come together, share strategies, share insights, share good food, right? And talk with one another. But I want to also thank all of you for taking the time to grapple with these ideas. So let me close my little piece with, I want to share, to get you guys riled up for these guys, I want to share a chant that came out of the housing movement. And it's a little complicated, but I'm going to need all of your participation, right? So it goes, 1, we are the people. Say that together. 1,
we are the people.
2, a little bit louder. 3, we'll get housing for our people. All right? 1,
we are the people.
2,
a little bit louder.
3.
We will get housing for the people.
Okay, that was a good get dressed there. So let's try this once again. All right? 1, we are the people. A little bit louder. We'll get housing for our people. I'm going to give this microphone to you because you haven't.
1, we are the people. 2, a little bit louder. 3, we want housing for our people. 1,
We are the people.
2, a little bit louder. 3, we will get housing for.
All right, girls over house. We might try that again. Finally, if you don't buy books, they don't don't get printed and they don't get published, so please buy the book. I'll be around and sign some. Thank you.
All right, okay. So I guess I'll start and just give a little bit of context about some of the work that's happening in Baltimore, and then I'll hand it off to Donald, who will elaborate more on some more work that's happening in Baltimore. So first off, James, we want to thank you for coming today and sharing your wisdoms with us. The book reads like an awesome lesson sharing guide for anybody interested in this question of what it means to build a movement for the human right to housing. And I just kept reading it, like starring the passages, saying this is spot on. So and lots of things to learn and things out there. So I look forward to our discussion. I work with an organization called United Workers. We're a human rights organization building a movement to end poverty led by the poor. And I see a lot of familiar faces around here and longtime leaders in this work, so they can speak a lot more clearly on our history and our work. So I give way to you all as well. Okay, so we were starting about 2002. It was organizing with homeless folks who were living in an abandoned fire station, turned homeless shelter. Most folks were working, and they were working as temp laborers, cleaning the stadiums as temp workers. There was no job stability, and even though they were working full time or working, they couldn't even afford housing. So that began after a couple of years of study and reflection, and a process of study and reflection and political education. Launched our living wage campaign for workers at Camden Yards, and in 2007 won that campaign. So at that point we started looking at this question of jobs, of where else are we seeing the sort of job instability? What else do we see service type jobs that create no stability for workers? And moved, of course, our campaign for fair development to the Inner Harbor, working with labor, working with primarily service workers at the Inner Harbor, supposedly our crown jewel, our economic engine for Baltimore City, where service workers there aren't even making living wages or driving wages. And looking at this bigger question of why are we seeing millions of dollars of investment downtown in the form of all sorts of tips and pilots and subsidies and tax breaks and bond issues, and folks who are working there aren't even making a living wage, and don't even have like basic sense of stability. And so we were working, primarily doing sort of workplace organizing, but realizing when we were going to the communities and knocking on doors and looking to the left and to the right and seeing vacant homes and seeing fire stations being closed down in communities and rec centers being closed down in communities, schools being closed down, libraries, basic public goods and public resources being shut down, that this question of development, we were seeing all this, that this question of development was crucial and central, that we're seeing this investment downtown at the expense of investment in communities. And so this development downtown really means a disinvestment from communities, and as we learned from James's book, like this sort of disinvestment is the first step in displacement. So our fair development campaign has grown over the past few years. We've worked. We had a couple of significant wins. We were organizing at folks at the casino last summer, and now folks there are organizing and we'll be having living wage jobs with the union, and we helped to save a rec center and fire station in West Baltimore. But really, one thing we're hearing when we're talking to folks is this question of housing was crucial, and decided to really take on this housing question almost about 2 years ago. so we formed this roundtable. And the roundtable really takes on this question of how do we build strong communities? And how can we see our human right to healthy, stable communities be met and be realized? And so we knew that we didn't have all the answers in the room, and that we needed to bring a diverse cross-section of faith, labor, community groups at the table to grapple with this question of how do we build a movement for the human right to housing? What does the human right to housing mean? And so, you know, in this process, and again, it was a long process of study and reflection. First, really looking at what is the nature of our housing crisis. And of course, we came to a couple of conclusions. One, we have an affordable housing crisis in our city. You can see that in all sectors. We can see that with the 150,000 cases of folks who go to rent court every year for non-payment. We can see that in our foreclosure rates. We have the second highest foreclosure rate in the country. We can see that with our number of people experiencing homelessness on any given night. You know, numbers vary like to 4,000, or you know, there's no. We can talk about that, but this moral crisis of people without homes and homes without people. So this question of how we have an affordable housing crisis in our city, and we can talk more about this in a moment, but that's not actually the general framework. It's, you know, we have this mentality in Baltimore City that we're, you know, a weak market city. We look at all this crap, you know, this housing that's falling apart. Of course we have affordable housing. That's sort of the narrative that we ended up hearing. And half of our fight is sort of reclaiming that story and changing that story to what people are actually experiencing, to what we're actually seeing. So one issue we came to is this affordable housing crisis, and then to build a long-term movement, it required again unifying folks who are often isolated in silos: renters, homeowners, and homeless. And one question or one issue that seemed to unify everybody in our city, of course, was this vacant housing issue. So we have around 40,000 vacants in Baltimore City. And of course, vacants are a crisis for everyone. It's we lose equity in our homes. It's a health and safety hazard. And of course, again, like I said, this moral crisis of how can we have a city with people experiencing homelessness and all these homes without any people. And so vacants were this issue that we could unify around, and how can we actually transform that question of vacants? How can we transform vacants into an asset for our communities instead of blight, or instead of an eyesore? How can we actually transform them back to productive use? So of course these issues are just symptoms of this deeper question, in this deeper crisis, which of course is our housing market. And seeing that we have this housing market that's wildly unstable and will always choose winners, and people who can work in that system and build wealth out of their housing, and then choose communities and individuals who are losers who don't get to play in that system. And so we knew that any solution that we wanted to approach had to look outside of the marketplace. So we had to look at solutions beyond our basic housing, our housing market. So we became really interested in the community land trust model for a number of reasons. The way, one of them is providing this permanent affordability question, stays affordable in the long term, and therefore creates a sense of stability. Of course, this aspect of community control. So communities are actually on the board of the land trust, directing and organizing and making decisions about the housing in their neighborhoods. And then this question of it actually gives people who wouldn't have home ownership opportunities otherwise access to home ownership opportunities. So we're really interested in the community land trust model, and at this point have really, in the last year, built out our campaign. Our end goal in our campaign is to see a permanently affordable housing sector that is publicly funded, publicly financed. So we see, again, going back to this question of fair development, we see all this public money going downtown, we see TIFs and pilots and bonds. Why can't we see that same sort of investment in our affordable housing and in community-based, community-controlled development? So again, the final vision for our work and for this campaign is to see a permanently affordable housing sector that's publicly funded. And the way we're getting there, none of this happens because we just have a good idea or we just have a good policy and we go, knock on our legislative door and say like, hey, can we get, $500 million? Something that just happens that way, we actually need to build power. And in order to do that, we sort of have mapped out a number of phases. Right now, we're sort of in the education and engagement phase, talking to communities. We do this through public policy work, through community organizing, through media. And so we're in this education and sort of dissemination of ideas phase. And then we actually need to do demonstration projects to show that community land trust and community control of affordable housing, and community control and transformation of vacant housing can happen. So we're working on developing land trust projects across the city. Right now we're working with 3 communities, one in West Baltimore, one in East, and one in Northeast Baltimore on building a community land trust, a little bit of a different model than the San Francisco land trust. And then, eventually we'll want to go over a public policy ask, which would be a bond issue or a people's tip. But that's a little bit about the campaign and where we're at right now. And I'm sure we'll have more questions. I'm going to pass along to Donald to talk about this work.
Praise God. Sadie, thank you. On the panel, I'm honored to be here. I would be remiss today if I wouldn't honor the people. First of all, there was an organization known as SNEAC, Save the Village Action Committee. I'm honored to have Ms. Robinson with me, with us tonight, and also Ms. Jillian, who is in the present organization, Baltimore Redevelopment Action Coalition for Empowerment. But again, I thank you all allowed me to be here. One of the things I want to talk about, Grace is the Baltimore Redevelopment Action Coalition for Empowerment. And so for us, it was birthed out of a project that came in East Baltimore under EBDI. The reason why I mention this here because we came later. But what is interesting to us, we saw the continuation of watching 700 families be displaced and with no real right of return. And with that being said, that's when Grace thought it was important to become a developing organization. But let me just talk about me, if you will, allow me for a moment. I came from a homeless position and I moved back into East Baltimore after being homeless in West Baltimore for 2.5 years. And the one thing that allowed me to realize and did not know that once I got back to East Baltimore, that once I moved back in my home on Chester Street, which is in the Middle East area, I thought I was permanently going to be there. I didn't have to move again. And not knowing what was taking place at the later time, I found that I would have to move. I had organized from SNEAC and invited me to a meeting. I was really devastated for the fact that now I have to move again, not knowing, and it was actually a tragedy to see 700 families move out and realize they couldn't come back to an area which was historical to the community. It saddened me to see that they were moved out like cattle. And it was devastating even to the people who had to move. But what is important to us now is to recognize that in order to organize the people to be able to take in charge of their destiny, you have to organize the residents in the community. We don't necessarily want people from the outside have an influence on the needs, because we too are educated in the understanding of what is needed in our own communities. Pushing forward, I began to hear about and was invited to United Workers to something called a roundtable. I didn't quite know what I was going to go to, but I thought, you need to explore other opportunities to be able to understand. And what I did like about the roundtable It allowed us to unify the faith organizations, the labor, and the community. Because without that, it would be an unsteady chair, if you will. But the important thing is to know that we need each other. Even though we have different approaches to the problem, we knew that there was one. And we want to be unified in a way that allow us to come together to find what can we do to change the carousel, if you will, the dynamics of what is going on in Baltimore as a whole. So I'm glad that I came to the roundtable, and not only that I've learned some things, but also I went to a 7-week leadership class. It was interesting. But it learned me to show that a lot of this stuff that's going on today, we did it back as far as slavery, all the way up to the present time. And a lot of things that we see now are a continuation of what's happened in the past. And what you don't know, and it is dangerous to you because you think it happened for the first time. But it was upsetting to see that nobody has learned anything. The names have changed, but the evidence is the same. So, being with the roundtable, I saw the unity. And then with the leadership class, I learned the education. And what we want to tell people from the organizing side of this, that we will continue educating people to empower them to make a difference. Because that's what it is about today. We got a system that is broken. And the reason why it's broken is because people are not educated on what they can do for themselves. And that's what we want to empower the community to understand. That you are somebody, you do have the right, and it's a human right to a house and education. You have a right to have a job that is supply all those needs. And you ought to be able to have a place where you can allow yourself to build history. And that's what's important today. Because when you take home from people, you allow them not to be able to be connected to each other and to the community where they live. So well, I'm glad for the roundtable. I'm glad for the fact that it could be a possible of a land trust, because people need to know no matter what you make in life, you should have a right to a home. You should have a right to where you live. You should have the power to make decisions. You should have the right to make a difference in your own life and to your destiny. So for me, the land trust is a major thing, because that way everybody has a chance to have a home that would not normally have one. So I thank you tonight, because I realize it's going to take all of us to make that difference. And I'm glad I'm part of that. Thank you.
All right, so I wanted to, before we open up for questions, I wanted to see if the panelists had anything that they were dying to ask each other.
I was looking at page 84.
Let me look at page 84.
Yeah, check it out. What page you looking at? 84. And a lot of things you said.
Unless you want to read your own.
No, you go ahead.
Okay.
I thought I forgot.
What, you want to talk about why we want to read this?
Yeah, the thing about when we read that
In the chapter 84 of the book, it's so much like EBDI, so much like Hopkins, so much like the city of Baltimore. It's a tragedy that here he's talking about somewhere else, and we got that same thing going on in East Baltimore. So that's why I picked that particular chapter, because this is EBDI all over again. It's Baltimore all over again. It's Hopkins all over again. We didn't talk about that tonight, did we? Institution, medical institution, renowned institution that is doing more destroying lives than building lives. We don't want to talk about that. But it's true. When you are healing people from the inside and hurting them from the outside. I'm going to leave that alone.
So I can read the paragraph where Donald doesn't have his glasses. Okay, gentrification doesn't happen all at once. More often than not, the first phase is disinvestment, when high vacancies and deindustrialization lead to low land prices. Eventually, developers, recognizing the future value of the land, buy up property cheap and warehouse it for years until the time is right to flip it. While there are many variables and differences between cities, there are a few major markers in the process of displacement. Following disinvestment comes rebranding. The neighborhood is marked as up and coming with potential for profits and cultural appeal. The rebranding process is complex because it requires an act of spatial amnesia, forgetting and marginalizing the history of the neighborhood, and cultural fetishization. Selective memory and celebration of the non-threatening aspects of the other. This is where the real estate industry gets to tell its story, providing an ideology that allows individuals to divest themselves from the consequences of displacement around them. It is the wink and the nudge to potential investors that says this frontier will be cleared. The final phase is hyperinvestment, which comes both in the form of private finance and public infrastructure improvements. The strength of the CLT model is that it can intervene at various moments in the life cycle of the neighborhood.
Just, in our area where Middle East is, they want to change it to Eagle Park. So that way, all the Middle East garbage that they have done can be covered up by a new name.
Thank you. I'd just like to, when we talk about the real estate industry getting to tell its story, the rebranding process, and all the shenanigans, I think it's also really important to realize that a lot of the ideology around that makes people embrace displacement isn't just from newcomers. A lot of times, the more savvy speculators will reach out to people that are, say, working class, but maybe a little bit more stable, right? You want those unemployed people out of here, right? You want those drug dealers out of here, right? You want these non-productive forces because literally, as you know, we have a 45-year process that we call neoliberalization. It's not just financial policy, but it's an ideological assault on not on public goods, but on our ability to have solidarity with one another. Or I internalize that the good of my family means the destruction of yours. My presence here means your exit, and lots of everyday people embrace these things. Oftentimes for absolutely messed up reasons, right? Just because because of their own baggage, but oftentimes because progressive, leftist community groups, we know the long-term solution is to get rid of the prison industrial complex and create a new day. But that doesn't actually answer people's short-term needs to live in a safer neighborhood and to deal with the complexities of violence that does not always come down from the state. It's always enabled by the state, but it's not always dealt out with it. So it becomes sometimes displacements. Most strident defenders at first are people who have the least to gain from it because they're sold a bill of goods. What am I was trying to talk about the second one.
I think one thing that the book really discusses well is this battle of sort of the mental terrain and this question of ideology, and how so much of this housing, this question of the human right to housing is a battle over ideologies. I mean, one thing that we studied in the housing leadership school is this question of what are the values that undergird all of the public policies that we've seen that have shaped, we're looking at Baltimore City policies, but these are national policies. So looking at things like redlining, blockbusting, urban renewal, PO6, now the RAD program, what are the policies what are the values that have undergirded all of these policies? Of course, it comes down to racism, private profit, individual ownership, and so much of what we have been fighting in this question of the human right to housing is how do we build a movement on values that on our values. Like how do we build a movement on an alternative set of values like communal ownership, communal wealth building, on human rights values of universality and equity. These are huge questions, and I think really speaks to a mental terrain that we're facing. At one point in the book, you talk about how ideology stole an opportunity, and I think that's I don't know, I just really like that language because I mean, even like the battleground over language is crucial here, and this is why our media work is central to what we do, and the education and engagement, just conversation around these questions. Just a comment.
Which is one of the things that I really appreciated about the book, James, was that it really was very clear that when we're talking about displacement, we're talking about two separate but intertwined phenomena. One is that we have what people commonly talk about in terms of gentrification, where speculation, rising property values push people out of housing. And then we have another, that's a market-driven phenomenon. Then we have another some strand of displacement, which is the one that impacts people living in public housing and subsidized housing, where we have this kind of federal kind of creep, lurch, headlong rush towards austerity that cuts the means of support, the means that provides a right to housing for folks away from them. And both of these are undergirded by really regressive class politics. Both of these are undergirded by a deep systemic commitment to white supremacy, but they operate through different mechanisms. And it's one of the things that I think people are trying to grapple with here, because on the one hand we have a crisis around affordability, but on the other hand we have a crisis around privatization. And I was just wondering if folks wanted to speak to how do we bring those two, resistance to those two movements together.
The overall, it's not just privatization; it's also deregulation. So the fist that privatizes public housing, right, is also the same one that deregulates and puts up barriers towards protections of tenants who don't live in public housing. It's oftentimes the same people, or at least their cousins, right? That's really central to understanding how to fight back. But it also gives a historical perspective. So when public housing was first established, right, it was actually very specific. It was a very interesting strategy, a very progressive one actually. The idea was to make more housing for everybody from the very lowest income to somebody who had a union card, who was doing okay. And there was an actual coalition called CASH, which kind of like the 1940s Tea Party, called Coalition Against Socialist Housing. And what they did, they recognized that a lot of progressives, a lot of leftists kind of infiltrated and influenced this program, and they realized that part of it was a strategy not just to create new units of housing, but also to create an alternative to living in slums, to actually create, put pressure on landlords to fix up the slum housing. So, through kind of supply and demand, right? Well, we have 5,000 units of housing here. Why would we want to go live rent from those guys? And they recognized that fairly quickly. So what they really quickly did was confine public housing only to the people that they didn't want to rent to in the first place, right? When originally it was actually making more for all, and that's really so fast forwarding over 60 years today, is that you see the neoliberal argument, and this really plays out in San Francisco. I don't know to what where they cut affordable housing funds, and they cut social housing funds, down to the bare minimum, right? You can probably get a dime out of HUD, right, to do anything positive anymore. But that dime, they're going to say that we are reserving this for those who are most in need, right? And like I argued earlier, is that you need to make more for all, but with specific attention to when you ask for more for all, for everybody who needs to stay in their city, that you don't use that as a bulldozer to ignore to ignore homeless people, to ignore historically dispossessed people, to ignore white supremacy, right? I think it's both. I think we're everybody in this room and everybody who commits themselves towards establishing right to housing, we're smart enough to do both, right? We don't have to get into class versus race, right? We can do both. We can attack both of those demons at once and defeat them, but it means stepping outside of a lot of the ways that we traditionally organize. It's like either we're all the 99% or we're all or we're all the small subsection of the 99%. We fight for reparations, we address the historical inequalities, but then out of that, we fight for more. We're all. Okay. I bet some of these guys can do pretty good at some smarts.
Yeah, I think that's probably a good chance to open it up.
Speaking of one of the smartest people in the world, one of my heroes.
I have a very simple question. That relates to the talk. What are some other strategies for decommodifying housing besides community land trusts?
Fantastic question. So one, unfortunately, San Francisco had an electoral campaign that we lost. It was called Proposition G, that basically would tax away the profit from flipping houses. So that was what was interesting about it. They got 45% of the vote, but basically it means that 45% of people who voted in San Francisco actually think that private property is not sacred. So I'm trying to think of this in a positive way. It was basically the most radical housing thing that had ever appeared on the ballot, because it said you just can't buy a house, empty all the tenants out, flip it for new residents, and it very aggressively taxed away for about 5 years, right? You actually had to buy a house, you actually had to hold on to it for 5 years. It's the first time that actually capitalist accumulation was actually challenged at the ballot box, and I think that's very important. Certainly, we're not going to get anywhere on the local situation unless we also look at the national trends. As long as banks are behaving badly, right? They will run roughshod and finance all of the nastiest things. This nastiest displacement. So actually, financial accountability measures might not be sexy, right? And they might not seem possible on the local level, but I mean, very effective campaigns to bring in community reinvestment have been done in the past, right? And these things evolve out of people's movements. And finally, my good friend Tom Angadi, who teaches up at Hunter, he really draws in a very tangible way in his book New York for Sale about how the profits from international exploitation actually come and localize themselves in the city. And I believe David Harvey actually talks a little bit about this as well in one of his many fantastic books. So when we're talking about exploitation of third world resources, so-called third world resources, through oil extraction from war, and through either through the exploitation of Africa or whatever, those profits come home, right? And so very, in a very, very concrete, non-rhetorical way, what happens all across the globe actually does impact us. There's a really, make it up to Boston on Saturday, the MIT is actually having an international symposium on displacement. I think that's actually a step that we have to take, is learning from Brazil, learning from our comrades from Spain that will be here, in trading tactics, trading strategies, identifying common enemies. So those are a few things, and I'll probably think of a few more since I asked them.
I think the question about decommodification of housing, of course, the obvious answer is social business, public housing. This creating actual robust public housing system that's publicly funded, in a robust way. We know it's publicly controlled, sure. Unfortunately, what we see is exactly the opposite. Instead of increasing public housing supply and increasing public housing stock, like the HUD's budget was at its highest in the late 70s, and like progressively cut year after year with Reagan economics and also this politics of austerity, and now we have programs like RAD, which are of course just selling off our private housing. So it unfortunately feels like a really dead on arrival type of public policy where you're pushing for more affordable, for more public housing. Yeah.
When we have great discussions like you are having with everybody, and it's so clear. I'm somewhat saddened sometimes when I really think about what really is happening. You know, the idea that things, the way the system is, things are happening just like they're supposed to happen. And to me, it's amazing how these subjects intertwine even with immigration. And you think about it from the black community, gentrification, and in the black community, people always say, you know, those Koreans come here and they take over all the stores and they do that. But the reality is, one reason they organize in that way and make their money run around or whatever ethnic group come in, because there's a certain kind of nationalism that they realize as soon as they come here, they learn better than anybody, that's the only way to survive, because in America, the only way we really are accepted or can get anything is through white supremacy and free market capitalism. So it's really a conundrum to organize people in that mass way, and when you start thinking about it, it's really frustrating, but it actually makes sense for people to do that, to survive.
Who wants to respond to that? Do you want me, anybody ready for a response, or do we want to take another question first?
Let's take another question.
All right. So let me grab your hand, and then I do hope the United Workers can talk a little bit about their experiences with interracial organizing.
So I was wondering, you were commenting about how finance is now influencing the market, how corporations are now influencing person. And there's this huge movement to get money out of politics and such. And with the housing movement that you guys are doing, what do you think should come first? Getting money out of politics or so influencing public housing and such, or maybe get two birds in one stone?
So I'll repeat the question back. So the question was, is it what should come first, getting money out of politics or tackling the housing crisis? And certainly, I would do whatever makes people start to build boldness and start to feel like they can be agents of change in the world, in your community. Getting money out of politics is, it's certainly possible. I mean, when I was in this really intense debate, as happens in leftist circles around electoral politics, right? And it was very morally based, like don't vote, versus like your vote is your voice. How dare you talk about not ever voting because people fought and died for it, versus don't vote, it only encourages them, screw you, screw you, screw you. But what struck me is that there's this whole other thing around gentrification and electoral politics, is that, and it's coupled with the voter disenfranchisement that you see now in more rural areas, where gentrification disperses people who have commonality all over the place, right? So the idea that you could actually vote to change Baltimore becomes more and more, more and more unlikely as people are pushed out. We're starting to see that. Even progressive trade unions that do a fairly good job of standing up for folks. Well, if your folks, live and vote in Richmond but work in San Francisco, that's being closed down, right? And then coupled with that, we have this massive rollback of all the awesome work and all the gains of the civil rights movement that Betty was a part of through these voter disenfranchisement stuff. So very quickly, the avenues towards electoral revolt are getting closed down. And I'm not saying that we don't we don't engage with that because I like to vote and I like to write. I like both, right? But a lot, very materially, these options are being shut down, so we have to be very clear about the interplay between what the actual possibilities during this period of time are.
I'll respond to that too. It seems to me that there's enough of us that we can work on both, getting money out of politics. And there is a movement in Maryland to pass the same resolution that was passed in the California and the Vermont legislature, calling for a constitutional, I might get it wrong because I'm not totally schooled on it, but it's calling for a constitutional convention to have an amendment to the Constitution to deny that corporations are people. So that's going on in Maryland, but there are all these fabulous housing organizers who are doing great grassroots work. So it seems to me it's both. It's you pick the issue that speaks to you, and you work as hard as you can to bring that into fruition, and you also don't have to stick to just one issue. And so the challenge is, where are you going to get active? What are you going to pick as your issues, and what are you going to do? These folks are doing some great work. So.
I got a question over there.
I have kind of two questions. One of them is kind of complex, the other is actually probably pretty simple. So I'll start with the simple one. A lot of the vacant homes in Baltimore have been a victim of this land banking for so long that they're completely uninhabitable. So I find the argument intriguing with like vacant homes and people experiencing homeless people, and like let's match that up. But where's the financing coming from that we're not just becoming like publicly funded slumlords, essentially? The second question is, there's also a large movement, since we're talking about money and financing and social entrepreneurship, especially in the city. In fact, there's social breakfast tomorrow morning that's happening here. And I know there's some great work happening in Greater Homewood with Chris Wilson doing employment training. Humanum has details doing deconstruction work, and we're actually employing lots of people in Baltimore City as a result of kind of these conundrums in housing. But is there any model for creating social enterprises that gain and exploit the capitalist system to the ends of positive benefit for people who are in housing?
I can speak. To speak to the first question, well, I guess I first want to hope that my argument around how we use vacant homes as a resource as opposed to just blight is clear, and that our affordable housing crisis is so deep, this is not just a homeless crisis. And sometimes when we talk about the issue of vacancy, we talk about housing affordability, it seems like we might only be, we have to show that this crisis is deep and affects everyone in ways that it has never before. So this is not just a homeless issue. This is an issue for thousands upon thousands of renters. For everyone experiencing housing instability, which is homeowners and renters. And then your question, absolutely right. Like a lot of our vacant housing stock needs to be torn down, and communities will be the first. Communities can identify which buildings those are, and that's absolutely true. Now, I think the argument often when we talk about the work we're doing is the question of equity comes to mind for me. And so when we just got our AG settlement for all of the the subprime mortgage lending. Baltimore City got $22 million and went to the vacancy values program to demolish housing. This question of equity comes to mind for me, is that why are we prioritizing demolition as opposed to the building of permanently affordable housing opportunities in our city? Now, with that said, I think communities are at the forefront of need to be at the forefront of making decisions about housing. So need to be making decisions about which homes we're demolishing and which homes we're rebuilding. Of our stock of 40,000 vacant homes, I couldn't tell you what percentage of those need to be demolished, but of course, a big piece of that is true. And then the issue, again, with the community land trust model is that it's not this magic bullet that all of a sudden is like magical financing attached to it. And that just like any other sort of community development work, it comes with the same challenges of community development work, which is that there's not a lot of money out there and that you have to figure out how to finance your work. There are certain creative ways and have to play the same game and have to get capital from all sorts of different areas to get started.
I want to respond. I see your hand. Tax increment financing in San Francisco, because of really fantastic organizing done by people who came in the movement right before me, they basically got a people's TIF where 50% of tax increment financing actually went to human needs, right? Actually went to affordable housing. San Francisco ironically has 26,000 units of vacant housing thanks to really dogged, amazing community organizing, standing out folks and trying to apply the values of community control coming out of the 60s and 70s. 26,000 units still hasn't made a dent in the overall affordable housing, but there's still 26,000 units of housing that are safe, decent, affordable because of this. So I think the people's TIF idea is something that should be played around and perfected. But historically, social housing has always done the best with direct in public investment based on progressive taxation. And that's whether you're talking about the New Deal or you're talking about Red Vienna, which I talked a little bit about in the book, thousands of units. That's when it does the best. And it's going to take a movement to even get us back in or where we can think of that as a possibility.
Well, here we sit in Station North, which is a heart of what we're talking about, and I think it needs to be said that that's the case. And I'm very interested in where this land trust is in the Northeast because it needs to be in Green Mountain West. There needs to be one in Green Mountain West yesterday, helping the residents, helping them articulate their desires and making that a possibility. There are models. There's a model right here in Baltimore, and it's called GETCO, Governance Economical Development Corporation. They started their own development corporation, and they saved Stadium Place. They invented it, they created Stadium Place, which is affordable housing for working people. What did that take? We need to look at what did that take. And one of the things that's important to remember is that if you go and you look at Stadium Place, and that Stadium Place is housing for people, that's where the old Memorial Stadium used to be, and it's 40 acres. And one of the things they were told was they had to have participation by the people. The mayor said, these people have put up with those Oriole and football fans all these years. They need to have participation. So they were required by law. It was required that the community participate. The other thing is, if you look all around there are very, very strong community organizations in that area. They did it by consensus model. They articulated what they want, and they're making it happen. Why don't we utilize that model? Why don't we consult with them and do something right here now? I'm ready.
You guys ready?
Yes.
Are you going to start talking to these organizations and the other ones that have already taken a few steps? All right. Are you ready?
Yes.
All right, cool. I want to make sure y'all are ready. Other questions?
Question in the back here.
So James, I noticed that you're wearing a hometown jail shirt, and I'm curious what your thoughts are on how the work that hometown jail does with
wearing my Homes Not Jails t-shirt kind of as tribute to Ted Gullickson, who was the founder of the San Francisco Tenants Union, a working class Bostonian who makes an appearance in this book, who died three weeks ago, and he was also a co-founder of Homes Not Jails. Homes Not Jails today is in San Francisco is just doing really good survival squads, and we don't have a lot of vacancies. We're not like you guys where we have 40,000. We may have 400, maybe a little bit more, but we don't have all the opportunities that you guys have for this, because the opportunity for this form of direct action, this brand of direct action, is very, very geographically specific. And one of the things that Homes Not Jails did that was very, very, when it was at its most successful, which I actually opened up the book about, is when they didn't just go into a community like they had many times before, right? Open up a squad and say, okay, we're here. We're fighting the right fight. You should join us. But they actually worked with women going from welfare to work for over a year, ironing out how to work together, and they took over vacant housing in public housing, right? And got 250 units brought back, right? So that was kind of Homes Not Jails at its very finest, when it was kind of taking at that time it was a very scruffy anarchist, very dreadlocked, very black patchy folks, actually learning how to talk and how to listen to folks that didn't look like them, right? That didn't think like them, that had different conditions, and finding what they actually had in common, and then finding different roles. And it was really powerful, and it was powerful because people took a step back and said, my preference for using direct action and that bravery that goes along with it, that's just so beautiful, is important, but it's also, when your participation and your self-determination and your autonomy in this movement is also really important. And they took a year and they made something really magical happen, which is in there. So, squatting, it's a great idea, it's a beautiful thing, but don't think that we're, say, 1980s Brussels or anything like that. The conditions that face us here, even in communities that have lots of vacant housing, are very, very different. The police and surveillance state are very different, so don't fetishize squatting, and that's, definitely, no matter what, I make this argument in the book, is don't get so caught up in the electoral legislative stuff that you fail to take direct action that's appropriate to your community, at a level of a design that's appropriate to your community.
I just wanted to say one thing on the squatting piece. Willie Baptist wrote your. Thanks. Thank you. So Willie Baptist wrote the forward of the book, and he's a founder of the Poverty Initiative and has been a long time leader and supporter of United Workers. And he says he was part of the Philadelphia Homeless Union that did a lot of support of squatting, a lot of takeovers. There's a whole takeover about these takeovers. But he has a really interesting take on the effectiveness of takeovers, and it's not like a do it or not do it, just this question of like what happens in the aftermath. And I'd be curious if James shared this analysis, but it seems that sort of Willie's critique of it is that what happened in Philadelphia is they got this program, like they won over all these homes. It became a program, Hope Housing, or something like along those lines, like hundreds of homes in this like nonprofit affordable housing project, and it ended up just sort of slowly becoming more and more conservative, like losing that radical sense of the human right to housing and just becoming another nonprofit affordable housing developer. And so he has like a critique of it, sort of like always understanding that sometimes like professionalizing the work or like getting the money for the work ends up sort of the risk of co-optation there.
I wanted to just to answer the Baltimore question and speak on behalf of the panelists who aren't here, but who you should definitely check out their work. As far as I understand it, and I'm putting words in absent people's mouths, so I don't want to screwing it up. But as far as I understand the history of the Right to Housing Alliance, they actually came out of an effort initially to do direct action modeled on the, not on occupations, but on the City Life Leader Urbana sword and shield model for doing community blockades to prevent evictions. And what I understand of their trajectory is that they realized that actually what they needed to do was focus on building community power and on organizing tenants around the needs that they had in low-income housing, rather than kind of just focusing on the packaging of direct action. And that's not to say that direct action wouldn't work in Baltimore, but that one group that tried felt that they needed to kind of take a step back from the militancy of the tactic and build the militancy of community-led organization instead. So I think we have time for one question, and then we'll thank our panelists and wrap up and hopefully buy some books.
So just a couple things I'm wondering about. One is, you talked about co-opting. I think it's important in all the work, and I say it's Mayor's on end, but I think it's, some people alluded to it. So I have a comment and a question about neighborhoods that are already in the process of gentrification and sort of what people have done. But yeah, in terms of co-opting the work and having it go in a direction that is actually not wanted, I think it's important to recognize the various differences in power and privilege when doing this work together. Very important, very, very important to think about. So when we say things like race and class, let's not, I think we need to just remain steadfast in understanding that how our different bodies are impacted in these movements and impacted in the work. The other thing I was going to say is, I'm working right now in a community where, rapid gentrification is happening. I'm watching and trying to do work, a very slow process of community relationship building, community building, using various methods or whatever. But I'm watching from the inside of a community where there's a small segment of folks that happen to be white folks who are more new to the area, to have power and say in how things flow, and the folks that have been there for generations are actually being erased from that process in various ways, and that process is like rapidly happening. And so how do you approach the work from that, or speak to that in terms of approaching the work from something that's already kind of having momentum?
I'm glad we're in that position right now. And for us to continue empowering people that in the community, for us, is a major thing to do, and recognize partnership with other organizations, like I'm doing the round table, and my organization does many other things. I think right now is important because there is a diverse, we have to have diversity in what we're doing, because much as we recognize it's happening in poor neighborhoods and particular people of color, but the problem is that there's an urgency that needs to take place now, because as the young lady got up and said, that what we need to do is combine ourselves together now. We can sit in meetings like this forever, but if we don't strengthen each other to say we need to help one another, it's important. Your issue and your concern is my issue and my concern. And so what we need to do, and hopefully talk to you after the meeting tonight, but the reality of it is we need everybody. I don't hear anything. Okay, we need everybody. There's no big I in you with this. But the reality of it is people are hurting. People are homeless. People are starving. People are uneducated. And yet we have millions of dollars going everywhere else. We talked about downtown being increased in beauty, but the communities adjacent to them are being hurt. There's something wrong with that. So
I'd like to do a quick comment. It's usually at the end of these things when somebody raises $1 million question, so I thank you for that. That's actually the people's tip type of questions that are so valuable to the course of a movement. What I hope for each and every organization and each and every community that's represented here is that you're so successful that you actually have to grapple with being co-opted or not, right? That you're so successful at winning things that you actually have to have the burden of that debate. The way that we've dealt with it in the land trust in San Francisco is that we let the land trust be the technical support for the community organizers, right? So the people that are doing the campaigns that are representing base communities, they're basically identifying the building, saying, hey, you know, we're fighting an eviction here, and you think you might be able to help us intervene and take this off the speculative market. And we just basically have a simple division of labor, where the land trust isn't expected to be the people that are doing the organizing. The people who are already doing the organizing are expected to set the tone, and we come in and help with budgets and strategic plans and come up with policy ideas that are ultimately theirs to decide whether they want to back or not. So that's one way that we dealt with it. It's sorely lacking in answering so many of the other sticky questions. The last one that I'm going to just leave your last point is really poignant, because what we really have to think about is what are the limits of localism, right? If we're talking about community control, which means geographic, in most people's mind it means geographically specific governance. Well, if that neighborhood has been completely gentrified, right, or even partially gentrified, the people who are going to take advantage of the community, of the community board, the community council, whatever is established, are the people that have the most privilege to operate already, right? And they could have good politics, bad politics, in between politics, whatever, but they're not, but there's still a massive gulf of exclusion that's created will tear down even the most noble efforts. So I talked a little bit in the book about, I do believe ultimately under revolutionary localism, but I believe in not naive revolutionary localism where that's built and it has, and we structure ways of making sure that everybody participates, not just people who have the resources to already and the expectation that they should be at the table in the first place. And that's an ongoing project.
Okay, so in closing, I think one thing we should recognize is that all this organizing work is tremendously important. It's also tremendously important to tell the stories of organizing, to tell the histories here. And I see Betty Robinson here has done tireless work to document the history of women in the civil rights movement, along with the people she organized with. The work of Maricela Gomez, who's took time to document the history of the struggles in East Baltimore. Very important. And James's book, which is, it's not just a book about urbanism, it's not just a book about wouldn't it be nice if we did this, but it's a book that really tells the story of struggles that were fought from the first person perspective, from the lessons that were learned, in a way that we can actually understand what happened and why, and learn from it to do better in the future. So I am tremendously appreciative to anybody who takes the time to take notes. And your workers better be taking a lot of notes because I expect some history to learn from in the future. But I'm really appreciative of people who take the time to tell stories about the work that they're doing, and about the work they've done, and about the history that they've seen. So please join me in thanking our panelists, and please buy a book.
Let's do that. You can probably do a lot better job than I do.
Good evening. Good evening, everybody. What we usually do when we close out our House and our Neighbors meeting is I come up with a chant. She just appointed me to do so. So when I say, I'm going to say this 3 times. When I say fight, 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 y'all say housing is human right. Y'all ready?
Hold up. I need everybody. I
Yes,
need everybody to stand up. I need everybody to stand up. Come on.
So instead of doing it 3 times, I'm going to do it 4. Y'all ready? Fight, fight, fight.
Housing is a human right.
Fight, fight, fight.
Housing is a human right.
Fight, fight, fight.
Housing is a human right.
Fight, fight, fight.
Housing is a
that'd be great.